Good afternoon. This is the lecture recording for chapter 6. And I've asked you to read chapter 6 first because it introduces psychological egoism. And I'm surprised that he would actually put the chapter on Hobbes before the chapter on psychological egoism, because psychological hedon egoism actually underlies Hobbesian principles. So it's kind of putting the cart before the horse. So anyway, you need to read chapter 6 first and then read chapter 5. So today we're going to talk about psychological egoism. Sometimes it's called the argument from self-satisfaction or the argument from self-interest. I'm going to ask you to read the document from Epicurus that I'm going to place on Blackboard. It's an article on pleasure versus pain. Psychological egoism usually mandates that every act that we do be based on the principle of pleasure versus pain. Whatever causes the most pleasure versus abjuring the most pain is the principle on which we should act. Epicurus was the first philosopher to talk about um, pleasure, for he's the philosopher that coined the term hedonism. Although as you read Epicurus, you're going to find that his understanding of pleasure is much more quality oriented and favored than what we might understand as pleasure versus pain, or having the most possible um, uh, happiness that we could possibly get, as opposed to having pain in our lives. So anyway, as you read Epicurus, think about his notion of the quality of pleasure. Aristotle, we're going to pick up later, talks a lot about happiness too. For Aristotle distinguishes between happiness and pleasure, saying that to lead a satisfied life, one must be happy, and sometimes that means um, saying no to immediate pleasures. But Epicurus talks about pleasures of the long term as being most advantageous for human action. So pay particular attention to the form of psychological egoism in Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679. And Dr. Poeman mentions him in this chapter 6, but we have a whole chapter, as I said, devoted to him in chapter 5. For Hobbes, there's an implicit contract that each individual puts his or her name to at birth. So just by participating in a civilization in which he or she is born, uh, necessitates living by a societal contract. So by existing in a society or a country, according to Hobbes, we agree to give up some absolute rights so that all of us can live in peace. Without living in and by such a contract, there is a constant war of all against all. And because of that war of everyone against everyone else, the famous quote from the Leviathan, Hobbes's book on political theory, the most famous quote therein is, the state of nature, in the state of nature, the life of man will be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now remember, he borrows this title actually from the Bible. In the Bible, the Leviathan is the uncontrollable monster that inhabits the seas. The Hebrews were fearful of water. The state of nature is a negative state where even the strong fear the weak. There's an old joke from years ago about a guy sitting at the end of the bar minding his own business, drinking a beer, and this big guy walks in, drags him off the bar stool, and just beats him to an inch of his life. And he's standing over him and he says, "Jiu-jitsu from Japan." So the guy pulls himself together, and next week or so is back at the same bar drinking. And again, this big guy walks in, drags him off the bar stool and just beats him even worse this time, and standing over him says, "Kung Fu from China." So several weeks after that, the big guy that's beating up the little guy is sitting at the end of the bar, and the little guy sneaks up from behind him and just cold cocks him with a metal bar, and he's standing over him and he says, "Crowbar from Lowe's." So the point of the joke and the point of Hobbes is that even the weak can dispatch the strong by being clever. So none of us are safe in our beds at night without abiding by this cultural contract. Note, this is important for Hobbes. At its base, this is the only authentic reason for government. Now, as you read further in chapter 6, you're going to run across an American philosopher by the name of Ayn Rand. Read that section on Rand carefully. Rand was influenced by her interpretation, and she was incorrect about this, but nevertheless, her philosophy is, her ethics, her moral theory is vastly influenced by Nietzsche's Übermensch. In English, it's Superman, although it German means a little bit more than our word for Superman. For Rand, society evolves only through the efforts of extraordinary persons. So for Rand, it's my duty or the duty of anyone to seek his or her own absolute self-interest to the exclusion of all others. Now, this is a much stronger argument than Hobbes. Many people think that Rand fails to logically distinguish between selfishness and self-interest. Hobbes' observations are based upon self-interest, what we might call enlightened self-interest. For Hobbes, we are always on the cliff of falling into or returning to the state of nature because of selfishness. So it's in our self-interest not to be selfish. I'm going to ask you to play some games, some computer games that I'll talk to you later on in the lecture about, that looks into this claim. Rand is not the only one to misinterpret Nietzsche. Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth greeted Hitler on the steps of the Reichstag, and when he came to power and proclaimed, "You are the Superman my brother prophesied." So a lot of people misinterpret Nietzsche in this regard, including his own family. So for a moment, let's try to put the best construct we can on Rand's selfishness argument. So at best, it's a kind of trickle-down ethics, I guess we might say. By pursuing self-interest, according to Rand, by pursuing it aggressively, the superior person creates goods, capital, other services that make life better for all. We might consider certain objections to this, like the standard of living, the possibility of environmental degradation if we all acted selfishly. I'll leave that to your own thinking. And you should think about that because it might occur in a question later on. Rand has wide influence in American economics, not so much in philosophy and ethics. As a matter of fact, there is a political movement that many of you might be familiar with called libertarianism. This bears her stamp. So she's very influential in political theory and economics. Ron Paul, former U.S. House of Representatives congressman, is perhaps the best known libertarian, and his son, Dr. Rand Paul, who's the current U.S. Senator from Kentucky, is actually named for Ayn Rand. Current American libertarianism advocates for laissez-faire economics developed by Adam Smith, and we're going to meet him in chapter 5 because he's a Hobbesian. It's also sort of a laissez-faire moral theory too. Libertarianism suggests that we should be able to do basically whatever we want as long as it doesn't impact the rights and responsibilities of others. So for libertarianism, again developed from Ayn Rand, politics is economics and nothing more. It's not concerned with moral theory or even law. Now, you might guess, and you would certainly be right, that this contradicts 3,000 years of not only moral tradition, but legal tradition, the norm of which has always held that both economics and politics were subservient to and even developed from moral theory, religion, and public norms. And this is not just in America or Europe. You find it in Chinese philosophy. Confucius, the great Chinese philosopher. Find it in India in the Upanishadic philosophy tradition. Of course, you find it in Hebrew thinking, the Torah, the Old Testament. It's certainly a core teaching in the Hebrew Old Testament. And of course, Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and even Epicurus, that you hopefully will be looking into in the coming days. And of course, Christian philosophy and tradition. So let's take a peek into chapter 5. When you read chapter 5, I want you to pay attention to the 5 answers to the question of why be moral. To those 5 questions, to those 5 answers to those 5 questions that Dr. Poiman presents, Hobbes probably would add a 6th, and that is that the alternative to being ethical is so much worse, and that so much worse would be having to survive and live in that state of war of all against all. So if we do not give up certain absolute rights, there will be a war of all against all, and mass death and confusion will come to call. But we might ask the question, what rights must we give up in order to have safety? And at what point does life become intolerable because we've given up too much. Hobbes certainly draws from the Hebrew and Christian sense of original sin that seems to infect everything that Hobbes assumes about people, that they are by nature sinful and degraded. These are negative assumptions about human motives. He held that human motives, were inherently evil or malevolent. I don't know that he would call them evil, but they're certainly malevolent. This kind of comes from an Old Testament understanding. Jeremiah 17:9 in the Old Testament says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" So Hobbes would say that is essentially true, and because it is essentially true, we need the social contract. Let me correct the spelling of Jeremiah. Well, it's not going to let me do that. Now, lest you think that Hobbes invented this, and I think the way Dr. Poyman works with Hobbes, he doesn't know this longer tradition of a social contract that's far earlier than Hobbes, 2,000 years or more. So there's another much older form of the social contract in Plato's dialogue, the Crito. And Plato's answer is much more positive, at least in terms of his assumptions about human beings. Socrates chooses death over cowardly retreat from the city-state of Athens when it charges him with impiety. For Plato, moral right has nothing to do with humanity's misuse of it. It's not the right and the good. It's not the laws which are at fault, only human illogic. So the answer to this is to have a teacher like Socrates who teaches you to follow the thread between the two sides of the cliff. Socrates chooses to stay and fight even though it means his death. And according to Plato and Socrates, all of us owe loyalty to the standard by which we were raised and educated. And because of that, we must fight for the right and the good. To refuse to fight for what is right in the midst of what might be unfair is the obligation of the truthful person. To risk even one's life for the right and the good is the imperative of the true, not just logical, but the real person. It is individual and human flourishing that is at stake if we forsake our rational obligation. If we forsake that rational obligation, we will be evil and society will be degraded. So it begins at the same place, but ends up in a different place than Hobbes. But I just want you to know that there is another more positive tradition connected to this social contract. Now, this whole thing that we're talking about here is a little bit of a background to the section in chapter 6 entitled, "Why Should I Be Moral?" where Plato tells the myth of Gyges taken from Plato's Republic. Now, when you see this myth of Gyges, you need to really pay particular attention, hone in on this. The Republic is a later dialogue than the Crito, and so the theory has worked out a little bit stronger by that point. By the time of the Republic, Plato's argument had evolved beyond human flourishing to encompass the argument of the corporate drive for the perfect state, the Republic, which is not necessarily in existence or ever will be in existence, but it is the striving for the perfect state which results in a more perfect common good, not a perfect common good, but a more perfect common good. President Lincoln talks about this in his second inaugural address, where he talks about the better angels of our nature. And at some point, I think it would be good for you, for any educated person, to read that second inaugural address, because it goes to the heart of the question and the difference between Plato and Hobbes in terms of the goodness of the human being and what can be possible when good human beings take a stand for what is good. So for Plato, states can never be perfect, but humans can progress to rationally perfect a more perfect union. The better state, if not the perfect state, can come through philosophy and rational development if they succeed and perdure. In order to have a good society, we need a perfect goal, I guess we might say, in Plato. And that is why a person must logically be moral, else corporate life is doomed to perpetual mediocrity, if not evil. Now, I'm going to ask you to take a look at some computer games here. I believe, I'm not sure, yes, I think Poyman does discuss the prisoner's dilemma, but I'm going to give you a website where you can play through some of the iterations of the prisoner's dilemma, which looks into the basis of this claim that human beings will rationally try to do the right thing, and whether they really do or not. So I'm going to ask you to play through that, but let's take a look at it here for a moment. The social contract and egoism seem to lend themselves to the logical mathematical decision processes. Now, all of this comes from mathematical game theory, and you might have heard of Alan Turing. I think there was a movie about Turing 10, 15 years ago. And Jan von Neumann, they took logic, set theory, and probability and applied it to game theory. And in many ways, your modern computers and the games that you play on those modern computers are can be traced right back to Turing and Neumann and their work with applied logic, set theory, and probability decision making. And this game theory principle in mathematics was instrumental in breaking the Nazis' proto-computer code machine they called the Enigma machine. The concept of a zero-sum game can be applied to ethical decision making. So this has a storied history in not only mathematics, but in philosophy as well. So I want you to go to the following website and play through several of these games, these series of games. You make choices, you can play against yourself or play against the computer. Here's the website. I'll leave that for a moment so that you can get it. I'll also put the link on Blackboard along with this article, this document that I want you to read from Epicurus. Play through several episodes of this game to get a feel for how it works and what it might suggest about the truth or falsity of the whole idea of psychological egoism. And as I said just a moment ago, this link will be sent out on Blackboard. And you might at some point be asked to explain what you take away from the exercises that you did as you played through these games. Now, this is the lecture for chapter 6. As I said, please read chapter 6 first, then 5. And on Thursday evening, I'm going to send out a lab session so that if you're present, you can ask questions about this chapter, and we can go through the chapter sort of line by line, if that would be helpful to you, so that you can get to know the chapter better. And then next week we'll start on chapter 5 and do the same for it. So next Monday maybe I send out a lecture on chapter 5. Now about the quizzes. We've got about 50-something people in both classes, and I have only received 10 exams, and that is not good. That means that a significant portion of you are late. And I can't really do the grading until I get a fairer representation of what you are doing, since I grade on a scale. And if I grade on a scale right now, of the 10 people that have given me exams, the rest of you are going to be degraded significantly in the grades that you will receive. So you need to get them in. If you've got friends in the class, tell them to get these grades, these papers in. Okay. If no one has any questions, then we will end and look forward to speaking to you in the lab session, as I suggested, on Thursday evening, one of our times that we gather together in the evening. So best wishes to everyone. Please get your papers in, and I'll talk to you later.